In a nation once celebrated for overcoming division, a new fault line is widening. Across parts of South Africa, migrants, many from neighboring African countries, are facing hostility, exclusion, and at times violence. Supporters describe current actions as a necessary cleanup, a firm response to undocumented migration, rising crime, and pressure on jobs and public services. Now, critics, however, see a troubling crackdown, one shaped by political rhetoric, economic strain, and deep social tensions. Now, with unemployment persistently high, inequality among the most severe globally, and migration increasingly politicized, a critical question, of course, emerges in all of this. Are migrants driving South Africa's challenges, or are they being positioned as convenient scapegoats? On the conversation today, we examine the policy, the data, and the human realities behind one of the country's most consequential debates. Now, joining us on the conversation is Sharon Ekambaram. She's, of course, the head of Refugee and Migrant Rights Program and member of Kopanang Africa Against Xenophobia. I also have with me, joining me, Bolu Michael B., who's a foreign policy analyst, joins us all the way from Eswatini. And I also have Kelvin Chisanga, who's an economist. Gentlemen and lady, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I'm going to start off with you, B. How does South Africa's current approach to migration align with its obligations, under regional frameworks, such as, the SADC protocols and the broader African Union commitments?
Well, thank you very much for having me. South Africa is saying one thing on paper and doing another thing on ground. But the gap between its signed commitment in Africa and actual enforcement on migration rights is dangerously wide. And I say that because groups like March and or Operation Dudula are essentially filling a governance vacuum. And that vacuum exists because the state is not managing migration properly. And if we look at the context of everything that is happening, Operation Dudula is allegedly sponsored by a white supremacist group known as the Stellenbosch Group. And these people that are actually carrying out this dangerous act against migrants are not targeting, are not facing the right set of people. South Africa went through a process, a long history of appetite, and they're supposed to be challenging those sponsoring them. So it looks like a distraction tactic from the root, from the real issue. What can possibly a migrant do? Nigerians, for example, they are now up to 50,000 in South Africa. Some of them, most of them, might not even boast of 5,000 rands in their account. How can they possibly be the reason for the economic hardship in the country? But they are not challenging the inequality gap and the gap between the whites and the blacks that actually own the land. So they are just targeting the wrong set of people, unfortunately. And South Africa, they have a robust system, a lot of great ideas on paper. The challenge is implementing this thing, and it's not a challenge that is exclusive to South Africa alone. We see it across African countries as well. So that's the real issue here. That is a huge gap between what's on paper and South Africa's implementation on the ground.
When it comes to, Mr. Chisanga, what does the empirical evidence, indicate about the net economic impact of migrants on South Africa's labor market, particularly in both the formal and informal sectors?
In totality is speaking about 5 million in totality. But again, also, if you look at the working population, we are speaking of about 42 million in South Africa. But again, the issue that if you look at the numbers in terms of the formal employment, we are only talking about a small fraction of about 7%, which actually translates to something like 7 million South Africans and of course, migrants who are basically in employment. So in total cost, we'll be able to say that the total economic structure is not speaking of the best absorption in terms of labor market. We are talking of 27 million, in combination of the informal and the formal employment. And again, we've got job seekers who are standing on about 8 million in totality. So that already
Mr. Chisanga, I'd like to I apologize, but I have to just butt in here because we need to take a pause on this conversation. Of course, we're still having a conversation as regards South Africa and how immigrants are being treated right now. I still have Kevin Bolu with me as well as Sharon. Mr. Chisanga, I asked you earlier, what does the empirical evidence indicate about the net economic impact of migrants on South Africa's labor markets, particularly in both formal and informal sectors?
Okay, so a quick run through is basically to look at the total population basket, which is speaking about 65 million South Africans in that country. And obviously what we are speaking of is that we only have about 42 million people that are in employable stage, meaning we've got a population, working population of about 42 million. But out of that, we are only basically seeing a combination of informal and formal sitting at 23 and 27 million people. That already has left a deficit, a very serious deficit on the youth side, which is standing at 45% of the unemployed youth. That already has spoken into the current situation that we're facing, where there is this now xenophobia because of the aspect of employment being taken up by some immigrants. And what we are seeing is a fraction of about 5 million immigrants who have come from other countries to flock into South Africa, where they are now facing a challenge in terms of what is currently happening in Durban. But overall, what I should be able to say in this case that we have a situation where the sectors that are giving substantial positive effect in employment and many related aspects are basically capital intensity, where we're talking of financial as well as mining sectors, which are basically giving that vibrating energy. But again, if you look at the landscape, I think this has also been stemming from the apartheid that we actually witnessed in 1994 and the rest of the years that were down the line. So it has just been able to give that cascading effect, which basically can also now bring about ripple impact across the other countries which are nearby in the Southern African region. So this is what is actually basically playing out from there.
All right, let me come to you now, Sharon. How effectively is South Africa upholding its constitutional and international human rights obligations towards migrants, particularly the undocumented individuals?
So I would say that in particular, the Department of Home Affairs is failing to uphold human rights obligations towards migrants, and in particular on the issue of documentation. So, we've heard the facts around figures of unemployment and population in South Africa. But if we look for a breakdown of the migrants as a population, we have about 180,000 people who have come to South Africa seeking refuge from countries like Somalia, like the DRC, a number of people fleeing countries like Tanzania and Uganda, where they are persecuted because of their sexual orientation, and they are waiting for recognition of their refugee status and have been given asylum permits and have to go every 3 months or every 6 months to have their papers, their documents regularized. But the system has collapsed. So the asylum system is in a state of crisis. And the other issue, and we need to actually talk about this, that we talk of economic migrants. So yes, there's actually not 5 million. Stats SA says there's between 3 and 4 million international migrants, and predominantly then Black African brothers and sisters from the African continent. And if you look at the countries surrounding South Africa, whether it's Mozambique, whether it's Malawi, these countries have all been facing severe consequences of the climate crisis. We've had cyclones in Mozambique, we've had excessive flooding in Malawi, which has displaced population. So our country should be leading in recognition of climate refugees. And instead, what we are seeing is a practice no different to what Trump is doing in America with ICE in repressive measures, and what amounts to racial profiling, where you target people with the darkest skin and assume that they're foreign nationals and ask them for their papers. And something that's very traumatizing for many of us who actually fought against the apartheid regime, where you had the Dompa system, where you had things like influx control, and where black people were dehumanized under a system of racial segregation and repression.
Let me come back to you now, Bolu. To what extent have recurring xenophobic incidents, affected South Africa's diplomatic credibility, and especially their leadership role within the Southern African region?
Okay, that's a very good question. You see, South Africa positions itself as the big brother in the region, the same way Nigeria does in West Africa, Egypt in North Africa, and Kenya for East Africa. They always want to position themselves as the economic anchor, the democratic model that should be followed, or the peacekeeper in the region. Or you can't be a regional leader by abusing your neighbors. It's contradictory. So every viral video we see out there of migrants being harassed in South Africa is a diplomatic liability. Diplomatic liability that countries like Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Malawi are watching closely. Last month or a couple of weeks ago, I was in Mozambique, and I had a conversation with some of them, and I actually realized that many of them are actually happy in their country, and when they go to South Africa, it's basically for business or to do maybe a conference or something, and they are really hardworking people that I really admire. They really work hard. So when these people come into South Africa to just carry out their business and they're being victimized because of their skin color, it doesn't look good at all. And a person might be, we just saw a couple of minutes ago, a Tanzanian that is white. But in South Africa, the person might be African and still be white. And then, it might be from another country, but if, another person from the same country from outside South Africa gets victimized because of the skin color, it doesn't look good at all. So we've seen the countries actually take diplomatic action. For example, in 2019, Zambia, Nigeria, and other African countries, they recalled the ambassadors and issued formal protests following deadly xenophobic attacks in South Africa. Nigerian artists at the time also boycotted South African brands and refused to perform the artists refused to perform in concerts in South Africa. So when we begin to take actions like that, South Africa begins to realize that they don't exist in isolation. But we must be our brother's keeper, and we hold, a duty of care to take care of our neighbors, especially. So South Africa's image has taken a really bad hit, both economically and diplomatically, and the pattern keeps on repeating itself. So it's not a coincidence; it's just erosion of their credibility, unfortunately.
My next question is to you, Mr. Chisanga. How should we interpret the relationship between high unemployment levels and anti-immigrant sentiment? Is there a causal link or merely just a perceived one?
Yes, I should say I think there is a weak link in between governance system, especially when it comes to migration. And I also can maybe lead it to what our lady mentioned. I think there's a need for us to see how best we can create a strong policy buffer even for migrants, so that they should be able to have an equal balance as well in terms of participation, and also trying to look at a way of formalization in terms of migration aspect. Then also reflecting to what South Africa has been doing, I think it's also important to look at education of forte, trying to ensure that we put some levels of knowledge-based sort of learning, so that people should be able to see how they integrate into the migrant requirement as well from that basis.
All right, let me come to you now, Sharon. What patterns have you observed in terms of law enforcement practices, including arrests, detention, deportation, and do these align with the due process standards?
Well, Lawyers for Human Rights had to go to court to litigate against the government on the manner in which it was addressing the issue of arrest, deportation of migrants. And what was happening is that as the Constitutional Court in its judgment said that the practice of the South African law enforcement was very similar to what happened under apartheid, where people were being arrested and kept in detention without trial, because many people are arrested and kept in police holding cells and not even brought before a magistrate's court in order to confirm that the process was lawful in the way in which the immigration officer or the police officer conducted that act of assessing whether someone has their documents or not. But on top of that, what we are witnessing increasingly is, and we've just issued a report on this, that because the asylum system is in crisis, it has created lucrative grounds because people are vulnerable. Their papers are not updated. They're in a vulnerable state in the country, and law enforcement agents then take advantage of that and solicit bribes. And so it's actually become like the black market of the law enforcement, where on a routine basis, police officers, law enforcement will solicit bribes from vulnerable communities of migrants, and because of the fact that they are struggling to get documentation. But I do want to make a point here about SADC and about the neighboring countries and what we should be doing. If you look at Zimbabwe, it costs you $230 for a passport. Now, how many people in Zimbabwe with a 90% unemployment rate can afford $230 US dollars? So we need to look at what, like in West Africa, where you have one form of documentation for movement in the region. Capital goods are free to move on the continent, and yet black human bodies are policed in this way, and we see the kind of repression, particularly from the South African government.
Let me come back to you now, Bolu. How do you assess the influence of domestic political pressures, especially on South Africa's, foreign policy, posture now, talking about, migration?
All right. You see, South Africa's foreign policy on migration is being held hostage by domestic election cycle. Right now, it's heavily politically charged. We are seeing a lot of things going on. For example, the leader of the EFF is currently undergoing, questioning on things he did since 2018. Why are they bringing that now? What happened in 2019? What happened in 2020? A lot of things are going on right now, and politicians are just playing to the gallery, and that gallery is angry people, unemployed people, and people looking for someone to blame. And we've seen that, we've seen things, the frustration of people against migrants being used as a political tool during election time. So the result is South Africa now having a foreign policy that is inconsistent, reactive, and increasingly incoherent. Like I said before, there's a lot of things on paper, but when it comes to implementation, South Africa as a country is very weak. Parties like EFF and elements within the ANC have at various points in time used anti-migrant language to cut votes, the free migrants as economic competitors. That is not the reality, and South African officials, they go to international meetings and position themselves as champion of African solidarity and free movement. That contradicts with what's actually happening on ground. So the structural constraint is South Africa's unemployment rate. I mean, I live within the country, and the South Africa's unemployment rate is around 33%, which the highest among major economies globally. So when there are many people, when people are jobless, scapegoating is inevitable. Scapegoating becomes politically profitable, especially during election time. And no politician wants to defend migrants at the cost of his own vote. So the leverage point is separating the migrants narrative from unemployment narrative. They are two separate issues. So because they're being deliberately limited, job creation and migration, they are different issues entirely, and they should be sorted differently. These are policy problems, and they require two different solutions.
Now, let me come to you now, Mr. Chisanga. Of course, when it comes to migration, it's always important that we look at, okay, what can a country benefit from people who are migrating into it, right? So to what extent do migrants contribute to the entrepreneurship, the small business development, and even the local economic resilience in South Africa?
The beginning point is that migrants, they also have some levels of contribution in their skills transfer. Obviously, we understand where South Africa is coming in comparison to the rest of the Southern African region. Maybe I would give a particular reason based on Zambian case. We've got Zambians who have gone to South Africa who have actually been able to do perfect jobs around business development, SME ecosystem, and many others. So they basically bring forth a certain level of business acumen, which basically also has a very substantial effect to the economies there. And much to this also, I think there are also issues of small-scale business that are also basically helping to change the narrative within the township. For example, the case of Durban, where we can find some people lining up and down for small errands here and there, which basically complements to the bigger requirement of the business processing. So that and many others are basically something that we see complementing to the whole scenario. So in essence, there is always an entrepreneur ecosystem that interplays when the migrants are in a foreign country like South Africa, where they're able to meet small needs and maybe even just cross-border business as well, where they go back and forth to bring certain essential goods that are not necessarily available in South Africa from other regions. So that basically has a very strong telling effect in regards to the SADC, as well as even other economic regions and bodies which are basically advocating cross-border activities and engagement from that perspective. So it's something that has a quite very important aspect that we should be able to see in different circles of social and economic perspective. Much to this also, cultural exchange. It's one thing that also we need to see as a bigger component as well, because it brings about even tourism aspect, eco-tourism in essence as well, and even many other aspects we can actually be able to speak. Maybe another dearest example is what has been taking place in the political arena. Much of what we have seen in South Africa happening, some of the political figures used to be housed in Zambia, like Thabo Mbeki, Jacob Zuma, and many others. They were staying here in Zambia. They learned how to go about democratic tendencies, governance, policy formulation, and many others. So it's the same with what can happen from there, where some people can also bring some levels of social order, which basically have a knowledge sort of based capacity. So it's something that can also bring about capacity building as well.
I'll come to you, Sharon. Beyond the violence, right, how does systematic xenophobia manifest in access to essential services such as, healthcare, housing, and even legal protection?
So, I think it's important to note that the Constitution of South Africa and its Bill of Rights states categorically that it is a protection of basic human rights of all who live in South Africa. It doesn't say only South African citizens, and that's, deliberately crafted because of our past, because of apartheid as a crime against humanity. And what we are witnessing now is these vigilante groups. They're a small grouping. They're unable to mobilize on the ground. They appear to be much greater than they are because of, unfortunately, the way the media portrays this. And it's good for business. It goes viral on social media platforms, and it gets shared. And yet on the ground, they're incapable of mobilizing, and that's why they use violence and force in their strategies. And what they have been doing is standing outside public hospitals and clinics, outside schools, trying to prevent migrants from going into those schools. And yes, the question is, how do you identify who is a foreign national and who is a South African? And what we have done as Lawyers for Human Rights, as the Socio-Economic Rights Institute, and Section 27, all public interest litigating organizations, we have taken Operation Dudula to court, and we are currently taking the Department of Health to court to say that what is happening is unconstitutional, and the Department of Health must ensure that everyone who needs health care must be able to access hospitals. In a similar way, our policy on education, there's directives from the Department of Education saying no child must be on the street, whether they're migrants, whether they're documented, whether they're undocumented. So there is a response. We are pushing back against this as civil society and in courts, and we are winning victories against these unlawful acts of vigilantism.
All right, I've been having a conversation with Sharon Ekambaram, the head of Refugee and Migrants' Rights Program and member of the Kopanang Africa Against Xenophobia. Also having a conversation with Ms. Bolu Michael B., a foreign policy analyst, and Kelvin Chisanga, who is an economist. Gentlemen and lady, thank you so much for coming on the show.